The Kremlin's cold shoulder, deconstructing Russia's rejection of Zelenskyy's trilateral gambit. A bold, perhaps desperate, diplomatic overture from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, proposing a high-stakes trilateral summit with US President Joe Biden, implied successor to Donald Trump in the context of ongoing leadership, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, crashed against the unyielding wall of Moscow's current geopolitical calculus. The Kremlin's response, delivered a day after Zelenskyy's proposal, was a masterclass in dual messaging, a formally conditional, yet ultimately dismissive, statement from its official mouthpiece, and a torrent of vitriolic disdain from a prominent hardline figure. This multifaceted rejection laid bare Russia's deep-seated unwillingness to engage in diplomacy on Kyiv's terms, underscoring a grim reality: the path to peace, if one exists, remains paved by the brutal logic of the battlefield and Moscow's unbending strategic imperatives. The proposal itself, from President Zelensky, misspelled as Volodymyr Zelensky in the provided script, but contextually understood, was an attempt to elevate the conflict's resolution to the highest possible international echelon. By inviting the leaders of the two preeminent global powers, Russia and the United States, to the table with Ukraine, Zelensky evidently aimed to break the current deadlock in bilateral negotiations, secure more robust international involvement, and perhaps gain leverage through direct engagement with Washington, Ukraine's most significant military and financial backer. Such a summit, had it materialized, would have implicitly acknowledged Ukraine's centrality in a major geopolitical confrontation, forcing both Moscow and Washington to address Kyiv's concerns in a shared forum. It was a bid for a new format, a potential circuit breaker in a conflict that had ground into a war of attrition with devastating human and economic costs. However, Moscow's reception was immediate and unambiguous in its negativity. Russian Presidential Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's official voice, articulated a position that, while couched in diplomatic language, effectively slammed the door on Zelenskyy's initiative for the foreseeable future. Peskov stated that any discussion of a trilateral summit was contingent upon meaningful results emerging from the ongoing, albeit largely stalled, Russian-Ukrainian negotiations. This prerequisite immediately shifted the onus back to the existing, and profoundly problematic, bilateral track, effectively saying, solve the core issues between yourselves first, on our terms, before we consider involving others at that level. Peskov elaborated on the specific meaningful results Moscow envisioned, focusing on a temporary truce and maritime safety. He revealed, at the moment, everyone is focused on direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations. A list of conditions is being developed. A list of conditions for a temporary truce will be agreed, and thus the safety of shipping in the Black Sea one way or another will become an integral part of the probable future understanding. This statement is laden with implications. The list of conditions being developed is undoubtedly one heavily influenced, if not dictated, by Moscow. The linkage of a temporary truce to maritime safety in the Black Sea highlights a critical strategic theater. Control over Black Sea shipping routes is vital for Ukrainian exports, particularly grain, and has been a point of leverage and contention throughout the conflict. Russia's insistence on this becoming an integral part of the probable future understanding suggests a desire to formalize its dominance or influence in the region as a precondition for any broader de-escalation. Crucially, Peskov did not entirely rule out high-level contacts, noting that President Putin remains open to high-level contacts. However, this apparent openness was immediately qualified with a significant caveat: such contacts must align with Moscow's core strategic priorities. This is the crux of Russia's foreign policy posture. Putin, as Peskov emphasized consistently to his interlocutors, including to the American representatives, brings our position on the inadmissibility of NATO expansion to the east from the point of view of strategic interests of the Russian Federation. This reiteration of Russia's long-standing grievance against NATO's eastward enlargement serves as a reminder of one of the foundational justifications Moscow has offered for its actions in Ukraine. For Russia, any diplomatic engagement, especially one involving the United States, must acknowledge and address this core strategic priority. A trilateral summit where this issue was not central, or where Russia's stance was not given primacy, would be unacceptable. Peskov's framing, therefore, was one of conditional engagement. Russia might talk, but only when the agenda and potential outcomes serve its predefined strategic interests. There was little room for Ukrainian agency in setting those terms. While Peskov maintained a veneer of diplomatic protocol, Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president and current deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, unleashed a characteristically blunt and deeply personal assault on President Zelensky via his Telegram channel. Medvedev's rhetoric, often inflammatory and reflecting the more hawkish sentiments within the Russian establishment, provided a stark contrast to Peskov's measured tones, yet arguably revealed a more visceral layer of Moscow's perspective. He dismissed Zelenskyy's proposal as a desperate, self-serving attempt at legitimacy. Medvedev's mockery was scathing. He derisively referred to Zelenskyy as a green AF, the AF likely an intensifier, with a green perhaps alluding to Zelenskyy's political inexperience before his presidency or his party's name, though more likely a pejorative related to naivety or being an upstart. The core of Medvedev's diatribe was the accusation that Zelenskyy sought the summit merely to elevate his standing by associating with global power players. Why does the green AFID seek direct negotiations with the presidents of the USA and Russia? Medvedev sneered. The answer seems obvious. A conversation between three people means powerful legitimization of the insect due to the authority of those present. This insect metaphor is deliberately dehumanizing and contemptuous, aimed at diminishing Zelenskyy's stature and portraying him as insignificant, a pest latching onto figures of genuine global importance. Medvedev's attack didn't stop at ridicule. He leveled serious accusations against the Ukrainian leader, claiming Zelenskyy was plotting to delay elections, appease nationalist elites, and continue misappropriating Ukraine's defense funds. These are recurring themes in Russian propaganda, designed to undermine Zelenskyy's credibility both domestically within Ukraine, to the extent such messaging can penetrate, and internationally, painting him as corrupt, undemocratic, and beholden to extremist factions. The accusation of delaying elections, for instance, conveniently ignores the martial law conditions under a full-scale invasion that make nationwide elections practically and legally untenable. The charge of appeasing nationalist elites taps into Russia's narrative of needing to denazify Ukraine. The allegation of misappropriating defense funds aims to sow distrust between Ukraine and its Western partners who are providing substantial financial and military aid. Medvedev further extended his insect analogy to describe Zelenskyy's relationship with European leaders, portraying it as a parasitic symbiosis. He likened Zelenskyy to an insect protected by ants, specifically naming French President Emmanuel Macron, German opposition leader Friedrich Merz, misspelled as Merz, and UK Labour leader Keir Starmer as beneficiaries of this symbiosis. This implies that these European figures support Zelenskyy not out of genuine solidarity or adherence to international law, but for their own mutual cynical interests. This narrative attempts to discredit Western support for Ukraine, framing it as a self-interested arrangement rather than a principled stand against aggression. The inclusion of Merz, an opposition leader, and Starmer, also an opposition leader, at the time of such hypothetical commentary, though contextually this could be a placeholder for any prominent UK political figure, suggests a broad Russian disdain for the Western political establishment supporting Ukraine. The stark difference between Peskov's and Medvedev's responses is a common feature of Russia's strategic communication. Peskov provides the official, ostensibly reasonable, from Moscow's viewpoint, justification, adhering to diplomatic norms, however strained. Medvedev, on the other hand, operates as the ID of the Kremlin, voicing the raw, unfiltered contempt and aggression that underpins the official policy. This two-pronged approach serves multiple purposes. It allows Russia to maintain a semblance of diplomatic engagement while simultaneously placating hardliners at home and sending a chilling message of its true disposition to its adversaries. Medvedev's diatribes often test the waters, push boundaries, and signal a deeper intransigence that might be masked by more formal diplomatic language. The collective message from Moscow, therefore, was one of profound skepticism and control. Any trilateral summit, a distant prospect at best, would only happen if and when Kyiv capitulates to a significant degree in bilateral talks, producing meaningful results aligned with Russian demands, particularly regarding a truce on Russia's terms and cementing arrangements for Black Sea maritime safety that likely favor Russian interests. Furthermore, any broader discussion involving the US would have to revolve around Russia. Russia's core strategic priority of halting and reversing NATO's eastward presence. Zelenskyy's attempt to gain powerful legitimization, as Medvedev contemptuously put it, was thus thoroughly rebuffed. Moscow signaled it would not grant Kyiv the stage or the perceived equality that such a summit would confer, not unless Ukraine was already in a position of diminished leverage. The concluding sentiment from the provided script in Moscow's latest messaging: any prospect of a trilateral summit now hinges on what unfolds behind closed doors, far from press briefings and public posturing, where battlefield outcomes still dictate diplomatic thresholds, encapsulates the grim reality. Diplomacy, in this context, is not a proactive tool for peace but a reactive mechanism shaped by military realities. Russia's confidence, or lack thereof, its willingness to concede or demand, is directly proportional to its successes or failures on the battlefield. If Russian forces are advancing and achieving their objectives, the diplomatic threshold for what Moscow will accept or offer will be vastly different than if they are facing setbacks. This reliance on battlefield outcomes has several profound implications. It means that the bloodshed is likely to continue as both sides seek to improve their negotiating positions through military means. It suggests that Russia sees little value in diplomatic solutions that do not reflect its perceived military dominance or secure its maximalist aims. The closed doors negotiations, while potentially offering a space for frank discussion away from public scrutiny, are also opaque and susceptible to power imbalances, especially if one party feels it is negotiating under duress due to unfavorable military developments. Moreover, Russia's stance illustrates a broader worldview where international relations are fundamentally a struggle for power and influence, where the concerns of smaller nations are secondary to the strategic interests of great powers. Zelensky's appeal for a summit including the US president was an attempt to internationalize the conflict's resolution further and bring the weight of American power more directly into the negotiation process. Moscow's rejection, particularly the conditions laid down by Peskov regarding prior bilateral progress and the centrality of Russia's NATO concerns, effectively seeks to localize the core dispute on Russian terms while universalizing its grievances against the West. The biting mockery from Medvedev serves an additional purpose in this information-saturated environment. It's a form of psychological warfare aimed at demoralizing Ukrainians, discrediting their leadership, and signaling to the international community that Russia views Ukraine's current government with utter disdain, possibly as an illegitimate entity. This makes genuine negotiation incredibly difficult, as it poisons the atmosphere and suggests a lack of respect for the negotiating counterpart. To elaborate on the specific elements mentioned, the nature of meaningful results in bilateral talks. From Russia's perspective, meaningful results likely entail Ukrainian concessions on territory, Crimea, Donbass, and potentially other occupied regions, neutrality, abandoning NATO aspirations, demilitarization to a level Russia deems acceptable, and denazification, a vaguely defined goal often interpreted as regime change or a purge of Ukrainian nationalist elements. Ukraine, understandably, finds these demands largely unacceptable as they infringe upon its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thus, Peskov's condition is a high bar, potentially an insurmountable one without a dramatic shift in Ukraine's position or the military balance. Maritime safety in the Black Sea. The Black Sea is a critical economic and military artery for Russia. Control or significant influence over its northern littoral, the Ukrainian coast secures its naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea, projects power into the Mediterranean, and allows it to control vital shipping lanes. For Ukraine, access to its Black Sea ports is essential for its agricultural exports, a cornerstone of its economy. Any agreement on maritime safety brokered under current conditions would likely reflect Russia's military leverage, potentially restricting Ukrainian naval activities or granting Russia inspection rights or other controls, which Kyiv would see as a violation of its sovereignty. Putin's openness versus core strategic priorities. This is a classic diplomatic construction. The openness suggests a willingness to engage, projecting reasonableness. However, the linkage to core strategic priorities means this openness is highly conditional and narrowly defined. The primary core strategic priority consistently articulated is the issue of NATO expansion and the demand for security guarantees that essentially amount to a Western pullback from Eastern Europe and a recognition of a Russian sphere of influence. A trilateral summit would, from Putin's perspective, be a venue to press these demands directly with the US president, with Ukraine's fate being a subset of this larger geopolitical realignment. Medvedev's role and rhetoric. Medvedev has transformed from a seemingly more liberal figure during his presidency to one of the most vitriolic and uncompromising voices in Russian politics. His Telegram channel has become a platform for extreme statements, often employing offensive and bellicose language. This serves several potential functions. Signaling to the West, his pronouncements can be seen as a warning of Russia's implacability and its willingness to escalate. Appealing to hardliners, it caters to the nationalist and ultra-conservative segments of the Russian population and political elite. Plausible deniability, while influential, his statements are not always official Kremlin policy, allowing the government some flexibility. Peskov can maintain a more diplomatic front. Dehumanizing the enemy, his language about Zelensky, insect, aphid, is part of a broader effort to dehumanize Ukrainians and their leadership, making it easier to justify aggression against them. Legitimizing aggression, by accusing Zelensky of corruption, plotting against his own people, and being a Western puppet. Medvedev attempts to legitimize Russia's actions as an accessory intervention. The U.S. role in Zelenskyy's proposal. Zelenskyy's inclusion of the U.S. president is logical from Kyiv's standpoint. The U.S. is Ukraine's most powerful ally, providing the bulk of military, financial, and intelligence support. A U.S. presence at the table would, in theory, counterbalance Russian pressure and provide Ukraine with a stronger advocate. It would also mean that any agreement reached would have American backing, potentially making it more durable. However, for Russia, direct U.S. involvement in this format without prior concessions or a shift in Washington's stance on NATO is problematic. Moscow likely views the U.S. as the primary enabler of Ukrainian resistance and the main architect of what it sees as anti-Russian policies. European leaders as ants. Medvedev's characterization of Macron, Mos, and Starmer's ants protecting the aphid Zelensky for mutual cynical interests is deeply dismissive of European agency and motivations. It paints European support for Ukraine as opportunistic and self-serving, rather than based on principles of international law, sovereignty, or security concerns about Russian expansionism. This narrative seeks to drive wedges within the Western alliance and portray European leaders as weak and manipulated, or as equally cynical actors in a grand geopolitical game. In conclusion, Moscow's response to Zelenskyy's Trilateral summit proposal was a sounding no, at least on any terms that would be acceptable to Kyiv or align with Abelin's diplomatic process. Peskov's official statement laid out preconditions that effectively demand Ukrainian acquiescence on key issues before any such high-level talks. Medvedev's vitriol, meanwhile, stripped away any diplomatic niceties, revealing a deep-seated contempt for the Ukrainian leadership and a narrative that frames Zelensky as an illegitimate puppet. The episode underscores that, in the current climate, Russia is determined to dictate the terms of any engagement, and its diplomatic posture remains inextricably linked to the grim calculus of the battlefield. The list of conditions being developed behind closed doors and the diplomatic thresholds that emerge will continue to be shaped by the trajectory of the war itself, with Moscow showing little appetite for a diplomatic off-ramp that doesn't lead directly to the validation of its core strategic and territorial ambitions. The door to a trilateral summit, if not bolted shut, is certainly guarded by a series of Russian-imposed conditions that Kyiv cannot realistically meet without surrendering its fundamental interests, leaving the path to peace shrouded in the fog of war.